So now we're going to turn our attention to nutrition. Joining us for this session is Dr. Sandy Van Calcar and registered dietitian Mary Sowa. Mary has worked at Children's Hospital of Orange County for 28 years and in metabolism for the past 17 years. She has a specialty certification in pediatric nutrition. As an active member of Genetic Metabolic Dietitians International, she has participated in conference planning and the education committee and is past president for GMDI. In addition, she has served as a co-chair for the VLCAD Nutrition Guidelines and Toolkits. Dr. Van Calcar has been a metabolic dietitian for over 30 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and more recently, Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. She was a founding member for GMDI and served as president of this organization from 2013 to 2015. She served as chair for the VLCAD Nutrition Guidelines Project. Ladies, welcome back. We're so glad to have you with us again this year.
I'm going to go ahead and start talking while we get these slides to work.
Perfect.
So, I'm Sandy Van Calcar and Mary Sowa is here. We will be talking about meal planning in the fatty acid oxidation world and emphasizing nutrient-dense meals. Both of us have done some activities with Ultragenics, so that is our conflict of interest. This presentation is going to focus on diet management for those with long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders. So VLCAD, LCHAD, trifunctional protein, CPT1, CPT2, but any diagnosis where you will be restricting your fat intake, this will be appropriate for that person.
Sorry, guys. It looks like my computer is blocking me. Sarah, I know we sent a copy over. Do you have that by any chance? Technology.
So the first part of this presentation will be talking about diet in general, the components of diet, and what's considered healthy, what's considered unhealthy, and how this applies to fatty acid oxidation disorders. Mary will then take over and give more specific information about a low-fat diet for fatty acid oxidation disorders, including use of MCT, some tips for exercise and illness as it relates to diet.
I also wanted to add that I was able to join the roundtable discussion with Stephanie and Beth yesterday when they talked about their meal planning, and they had some really awesome personal tips. So I think a combination of what Sandy and I are going to talk about and what Stephanie and Beth shared is going to set everybody on a really good course for meal planning.
Another thing I'll bring up is that we will have this PDF available from Mito Action. So there are some slides that we have with tables that it's unrealistic for us to go through them, but we put them in there because they include good information, and we're hoping that you will go back and download our slides so that you can look at it more closely.
Sandy, do you want me to read through the objectives, or you kind of captured that? You did an overview.
Yeah, I think, but if you want to, go ahead.
Okay.
We're going to have to wing this till we have something to look at.
Okay. Okay, so on our objective slide, which is slide 3 of the presentation, we have described the major roles of the different macro and micronutrients in the diet, understand the key concept of planning nutrient-dense meals and snacks for individuals with long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders, discuss ways to incorporate medium-chain triglycerides into meals and snacks, and identify the important elements of pre- and post-exercise snacks, and then explain nutrition recommendations for sick day management which is in my section, which I'm just going to gloss over because we just heard that wonderful presentation from Dr. Corson about emergency visits and planning. And as Sandy mentioned, most of these slides and recommendation, does it look like we have some slides coming up? Yay! Okay, I'm going to stop talking.
Okay, can people see these now?
I can, so
Okay.
I think that probably means yes for everybody.
Okay.
So Sarah, you'll advance for us.
Yes, somebody's gonna, okay, great. So if you can keep going. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so diet is composed of both macro and micronutrients. The micronutrients are those main nutrients that make up the foods we eat. These include carbohydrates, protein, and fat. Each of these macronutrients has a unique role, and all three are part of a balanced, nutrient-dense diet. Even for those with fatty acid oxidation disorders, we still need some fat, and even though it's restricted, it is still an important part of diet management. Next. So carbohydrates are the main source of fuel for the body. There are three main types. There's simple carbohydrates or sugars, complex carbohydrates, often called starches, and fiber. Go ahead. Next slide. So simple carbohydrates are those with simple sugar, very short chains of carbohydrate, would include things like table sugar, soft drinks, white bread, pastas, some baked goods that have a lot of sugar. These are often helpful during illness or when people are not feeling well as a quick source of energy. But in general, we try not to overdo simple carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates include whole grains, brown rice, oats, quinoa, sweet potatoes, lentils, beans, starchy vegetables. These will be digested slower than simple carbohydrates and not increase blood glucose as fast as a simple sugar will. And then fibers include fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, lentils. The carbohydrate source from fiber is not digested, so it is a component in the large intestine that helps with preventing constipation, also has a role in maintaining blood glucose levels. Next slide. This is just a list of some examples for simple, complex, and fiber sources. You can see in general that they tend to be low in fat, although there definitely are exceptions. So when you are looking at labels, you will want to look at both the carbohydrate and the fat column. The labels will also list added sugars and fiber content. Next slide. So fat is, the major role is to provide energy and essential fatty acids. It's also required for us to absorb fat-soluble vitamins. Fats can be classified in different ways, such as saturated, unsaturated, polyunsaturated, trans fatty acids. For those with fatty acid oxidation disorders, we're more concerned about total fat than these individual components, but it's good to understand what those are composed of and what they will do for the body. They're also classified by fatty acid chain length. And most of our diet, there's a few exceptions, but most of our diet, the fat contains long chain fatty acids. So that's the reason that we are concerned about total fat in the diet, because most of those, 90% or more, will be made of long chain fatty acids. Next slide. So these are just examples of the types of dietary fat. Saturated fat is primarily from animal sources, so butter, cream, bacon would be examples. One plant source is palm oil. Monounsaturated fatty acids means that there's double bonds in the fatty acids, and these include things like nuts, avocado, olive oil. Polyunsaturated fats, which you will hear are what we need to consume more of, include things like sunflower oil, corn oil, soybeans. And then trans fatty acids are something that we're trying to eliminate from the food supply. These include hydrogenated vegetable oils, deep fried foods, and we are also listing the recommendations for the general public here, which again, your kids or you will be shooting for much less fat than what is recommended for the general public. Next. So fatty acids are a component of fat from food, and it depends on how long those fatty acids are, is how they're classified. So if there are 13 or more carbons in a fatty acid, that is called a long chain fatty acid. And again, food is primarily long chain fats. So when we restrict our total fat intake, we are primarily restricting intake of long chain fatty acids. Next. Protein can also be used for energy, but its major role is cell and tissue growth. Proteins are composed of different amino acids. Essential amino acids means they have to be provided by the diet. We can't produce them in our body, versus non-essential, which can be made by the body from essential and other non-essential amino acids. Adequate protein is always necessary, but it's especially important during periods of growth or increased demand. So infancy, childhood, adolescence, pregnancy, breastfeeding have higher recommendations for protein per kilogram of body weight. Next slide. So with long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders, we want to emphasize low-fat sources of protein. So animal-based sources would be lean meats and fish, low-fat or fat-free dairy products. Plant-based proteins would include legumes, which would be beans, lentils, peas. Powdered peanut butter is also very popular right now. It's low fat, but is made from peanut butter. There's also different protein powders that can be used, and light tofu. Next slide. So there are some studies that suggest that increasing protein in long-chain fatty acid oxidation disorders to replace some of the carbohydrate from the diet has some benefits. This includes increasing protein may increase lean body mass, so that's muscle mass of the body, reduce lipid content of the body. And even though these diets reduce carbohydrates, they are not causing hypoglycemia as long as you're following fasting recommendations. These studies have been completed in children over age 7 years. So if your child is below 7 years of age, you will definitely want to talk with your clinic about the benefits of a higher protein diet. Micronutrients is a big topic that covers vitamins and minerals. These major roles include production of enzymes, hormones, and other substances required for normal growth and development. Micronutrient deficiencies can cause visible and dangerous conditions, but they may also cause more subtle, mild impacts on health. And I think this is what we more commonly see in developed countries. There are more subtle impacts of micronutrient deficiencies. Next slide. So this is, again, a slide that you can look at later, but lists some of the water-soluble vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins, minerals, and trace minerals. I will say for those that are on a very low-fat diet, there is a concern about possible fat-soluble vitamin deficiencies, insufficient intake, or reduced absorption because of the low-fat diet. So for some people, monitoring these levels would be recommended. I will say that vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and this is it's pretty common in the population, especially if you live in northern climates, to be low in vitamin D, whether it's related to the low-fat diet or insufficient sun or using sunscreens. So that one, we typically monitor whether someone is on a very low-fat diet or not. Next slide. This is the nutrition facts label. The things that you'll want to look at are primarily the serving size and then the total grams of fat. The labels will list how much saturated fat or polyunsaturated fat is in that food, but for the purpose of diet treatment, you will want to look at the total fat content. And then this also has other information about what is on a food label. Next slide. So this would just be an example. These are low-fat granola bars. The things you want to look at is the serving size. So for this, it would be 1 bar, and total fat would be 2 grams. Again, the information about the breakdown of that fat is interesting, but for diet management, the main thing we want to look at is the total fat. Next slide. Meal planning, a bit about that. Next slide. So why do we want to plan our meals? It really allows you to concentrate on preparing and eating nutritious meals. It's really hard to maintain a healthy diet when you're not thinking about it ahead of time. It helps to set you up for success in avoiding excessive fasting and following your dietary fat restriction and adding MCT. Actually, it saves time and money and encourages variety in trying out new foods. So it may seem like this is taking a lot of time to plan your meals ahead of time, but in the long run, it's actually saving you some time and money too. Next slide. So how do you get started with this? So what you are going to do is think about your plate and how can I incorporate a source of carbohydrate, protein, and fat into this meal. What foods do I have? How much fat can I have at each meal? Considering fresh fruits and vegetables, how much of that can I add to a meal? That's always a low-fat source of a very nutrient-dense way to add to your meal. Think about, do I need to add MCT or essential fatty acids? Is this something that a meal that I'm going to have before or after exercise? And how does that influence what I want to be eating? Next slide. So many of you have probably heard of My Plate. This is a easy way to plan meals, and it's something that can be used for the general public. What this is kind of a schematic of how much you want on your plate, and you'll notice that half of the plate contains fruits and vegetables. It's an easy visual and assures that you are planning more nutrient-dense meals by following this visual. Next slide. This can be adapted for those with fatty acid oxidation disorders. Again, half the plate. If you're shooting half the plate for fruits and veggies, that's very low fat but nutrient dense. Also concentrating on low fat grains, low fat protein sources, low fat dairy, and then we need to consider including MCT. Next slide. So just a little bit about healthy sources of grains. So what is a whole grain? The whole grain includes the entire grain kernel. And I have an illustration on the next slide. Yep. Okay, thank you. So choosing whole grains from a nutrient when you're considering a nutritious diet, choosing whole grains is always superior to refined grains. The refined grains will have fewer vitamins and minerals. They'll also, with the refining process, lost a lot of the fiber. And even though some of the vitamins and iron are added back in, from an overall nutrition standpoint, they are less nutritious than refined grains. And again, checking the nutrition facts labels and looking at the ingredient lists, you want to choose items that name a whole grain ingredient as the first ingredient on the list, and then look at the fat content. Next slide. We are, so this is the difference between a whole grain and refined grain. A whole grain will include the bran and the germ, which are the more nutrient-dense parts of a grain kernel. The bran will have primarily be the source of fiber in a grain kernel, versus refined grain where they're just taking, it's called the endosperm or the starchy carbohydrate, and using that to make white or regular pasta, white bread. So again, we're cutting out a large part of the grain kernel when we're using refined grain over whole grain. Next slide. Again, I'm not going to go through this, but this is a list of different whole grain sources. Again, many of these are low fat if they're not adding additional fat sources or creams, etc. But on their own, they tend to be lower in fat. And again, the whole grains will provide fiber and other nutrients that you won't get as much of in refined sources. Next slide. So how do you add some whole grains to meals? What you can do is look at your plate, look at where you are using refined grain sources and switch it up for something that's whole grain. Whole grains can be such as brown rice or barley. Quinoa can be added to mixed dishes. You can prepare pancakes, waffles, those kind of things using whole grain flours. And also snacks. Consider whole grain foods such as whole grain crackers or pretzels, popcorn, whole grain granola bars. Next slide. This is kind of a nice slide of switching things out. So using brown rice instead of white rice, whole wheat flour instead of white flour, whole grain pasta versus white pasta. Next slide. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mary.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. So just continuing on for meal planning, to incorporate some good protein sources in our meals, look at some of your dairy sources, such as your low-fat versions or non-fat versions of milk, yogurt, cheese, cottage cheese, keeping in mind that these are nice sources of calcium and vitamin D. Good vegetarian sources in our meals could be beans, peas, lentils, and they also are good sources of folate, iron, and fiber. Our low-fat dishes are cod, haddock, pollock, halibut, and tilapia. And keep in mind, too, our skinless white meat poultry, such as chicken and turkey, are nice low-fat sources of good quality animal proteins. And there are also light tofu products, too, if you're wanting a vegetarian meal for the week, or if you are a vegetarian, there are some low-fat versions of this product. Next slide. And again, here's a nice table, not going through all of it, but you'll have this as a reference for you. If you look at how much a source of 3 ounces of chicken breast is, it'll provide about 100 calories and 22 grams of protein and be a low-fat choice for you with 1 gram. And if we look down a little bit further to our lentils, cooked version, a half a cup has about 150 calories, 12 grams of protein, and less than a gram of fat. So again, you'll have these tables for you of good resources of how to combine these into your meals. Next slide. And some other suggestions. So if you're putting your meal together and you want to add some good vegetarian choices, we can look at adding black beans, chickpeas, lentils to our salads, pastas, wraps, or soups or stews. We might want to incorporate protein powder into our fruit smoothies. Greek yogurt has more protein in it than regular yogurt, so that's a good consideration when you're looking at some breakfast choices. We did talk about that powdered peanut butter. We can add that to toast, oatmeal, crackers, or even mix it up in some fruit. Next slide. So Sandy mentioned about how half of our plate needs to be full of fruits and vegetables. So one other way to think about incorporating that into your meals is eating by the rainbow. So looking at our fruits and vegetables of the many different colors and incorporating those into our diet. They're full of phytonutrients and antioxidants to really help boost the nutrition in our meals. And on the next slide, we have a chart for you that looks at the different fruits and vegetables according to color. So if we look at our red fruits and vegetables, our tomatoes, watermelon, pink guava, grapefruit fall into that category, and they're full of folate, potassium, vitamin A, and C. And then if we look over to our blue column, we have blueberries, blackberries, elderberries, and they're full of manganese, potassium, vitamin B6, C, and K. So you can take a look at that chart too to help you incorporate some more color in your meals. Next slide. So some additional thoughts about getting more fruits and veggies into the diet or adding those really yummy fruits, your child's or your favorite fruits, into oatmeal, yogurt, cereals, making a really good smoothie. We can add spinach or kale to our fruit smoothies as well. Loading up our wraps and sandwiches with some fresh vegetables and pasta sauces. And again, making sure our soups and stews are full of vegetables. And a nice thing that I usually like to tell our families is keep a special area in the fridge and in your cupboards where this is your child that's on a low-fat diet, their kind of snack area. So things that'll be already washed and prepared for them so they can easily take something from that knowing that it's going to be low in fat. Next slide. So here are some sample breakfast meals. So as you're pulling them together, you can see we're highlighting the grain group, protein, and fruits and vegetables. So if we look at that oatmeal again, having oatmeal, putting some peanut butter on top of that, and then incorporating your fresh fruit, whether it might be bananas or berries. And then if we look that we're having a bagel for breakfast, we're going to top it with a low-fat cream cheese and then some tomato or cucumber slices. And then on our next side, we have some lunch and dinner ideas. So if we're having brown rice as our whole grain, maybe we're doing a vegetarian meal that evening, we're going to combine it with the light tofu and then steam our favorite veggies like broccoli, cauliflower, carrots. Or if we decided to have pasta one night, we're going to combine that with a vegetarian protein source, such as lentils or white beans. And then we can add vegetables either on the side or right in our pasta sauce. One of the things that you'll work with your dietitian on if you're on a low-fat diet is making sure you're getting plenty of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. These are all important nutrients in our diet, as Sandy mentioned earlier. And then if your dietitian is concerned that you might be running low in these on your low-fat diet, she may ask you to supplement them with a multivitamin. Next slide. So we need to talk about essential fatty acids when we're on a low-fat diet. Essential fatty acids are like amino acids where our body doesn't make these and we need to take them in from the food in our diet. So the two main essential fatty acids are linoleic and alpha-linolenic. And linoleic is converted to an important fatty acid, arachidonic, and alpha-linoleic is converted into a very important fatty acid that you've heard about, DHA. And so the major roles of these for our arachidonic is they help with brain growth and development. And DHA is very important in vision. You've heard a bit about that with LCHAD and nervous system function. So you're likely, your child or yourself is going to be monitored for your essential fatty acids in your blood, probably like twice a year, routinely, just to make sure that you're not over restricting on your fat. And there may, instead of increasing the fat in their diet, your dietitians may take an approach where they'll provide one of the oils in the diet that are high in these essential fatty acids or supplementing DHA to make sure we're meeting your needs. Next slide. Bedtime snack is super important in the long chain fatty acid oxidation world, even in our MCAD world as well. We want to make sure that our children are having a good bedtime snack before they go to bed, before they're getting their longest fasting time of the day. So some ideas, combining a grain with a protein source are things like whole grain toast with a low-fat peanut butter. We could do low-fat cottage cheese with yogurt and fruit. You could do a half a turkey sandwich on whole grain bread with some skim milk. And if some of these ideas are not hitting the mark, work with your dietitian on things that your child really likes. For many of the younger children, formula is going to be a big part of their bedtime snack. Next slide. Okay, talking about MCT a little bit. We know that's an important part of our prescription for patients with long-chain fatty acids. So depending on the disease severity of your child or yourself, the MCT that's going to be recommended in your diet is going to vary from person to person. And one of the things that you're going to be working with your dietitian on is, especially as you get older, is how to incorporate that into meals and snacks. I learned a new tip yesterday on the breakout session about drizzling MCT oil on pizza to get that in. I know Stephanie said that she didn't have a problem with the smoke point of MCT, even cooking her pizza up to 400 degrees. So I think it's great that we're all able to share these tips so I can bring that back to my families. So the next slide shows a chart of the common MCTs that we have available in the US. We have Beta Quick, Liquigen, which are both emulsified MCT sources. We have MCT oil, the MCT ProCal, and we now have our C7 product, the Dojolvi. So they vary in their amounts of MCT. And again, you're going to be working with your dietitian on the optimal dosing and what's best for you or your child. And you might even see that you're using a combination of a few of these products to help meet those needs. And next slide. So some ideas about what you can mix MCT in. We can add it to smoothies, oatmeal. We talked about the pizza just a minute ago. Mix it in our mix with pancakes. Put it in baked goods. If you're making your own homemade popsicles, you could try mixing that in there. And here's a disclaimer about it having a low smoke point at 320, but we did hear yesterday that Stephanie doesn't have any problem with that on her pizza. And these, if you're not familiar with these, your dietitian has access to these resources on the GMDI website and the Nutrition Management Guidelines for VLCAD. But the book on the left-hand side is from the Children's Hospital Colorado Clinic, where they pulled together recipes using the MCT ProCal, the powdered product. The second source is a cookbook from our Australian friends. And again, these are available on our sites. The Food Kitchen Cookbook is out of Dr. Gillingham's research lab. So lots of recipes using MCT oil there. And then the last resource there is from the VitaFlow website. And there's a two-sided ideas of different simple recipes of mixing MCT ProCal. When we talk about exercise, I'm sure those of you who are familiar with Melanie Gillingham's work are familiar with these recommendations, but incorporating MCT into that. First, we'll talk just about general recommendations. So please always check with your provider what are going to be the recommendations for your child. Some people are going to have more limitations in the amount of exercise that they can handle, but we do want to promote regular physical activity because we know that helps promote lean body mass, reduce heart rate, and improve muscle substrate oxidation. And as Sandy mentioned earlier too, increasing protein is an important part of that. So this next slide talks about how to incorporate the MCT into exercise. We really think this is a good fuel for the muscles. It can help improve episodes of rhabdomyolysis and improve our lab values of creatine kinase. It's been looked at in the studies to be tolerated best 20 to 45 minutes before exercise. The amount you're going to use is going to be very individual, so you're going to work with your provider and your dietitian on that. And then what's important after the exercise is consuming a nice snack and a ratio of 3 carbohydrate grams to 1 protein gram as a snack to help refuel our muscle glycogen stores. And the next slide is some ideas that come from a handout from the Oregon Sandy's Clinic about ideas to use for pre-exercise, combining carbohydrates and MCT, and then what to use for a post-exercise snack. So we have experienced that MCT is tolerated fairly well if we mix it in Gatorade or apple juice. And again, the amount's going to be very individual. And then again, getting that post-exercise snack with the carbohydrate to protein ratios, such as berries and Greek yogurt, to help refuel those muscle glycogen stores. We know how important fluids are. We heard Dr. Kersen talk about how much IV hydration is important when their kids are sick, but just even our general fluid needs, about it helping all cells, tissues, and organs in our bodies, and what special things that increase our needs for fluids are things such as hot climates. And we all know it's been very hot around the country this summer. If you're going to be more physically active, your fluid needs go up. And then in times of illness, our fluid needs increase. So some tips to help you make sure you're meeting your fluid needs are on this slide. So I know what's helpful for me personally is to have a water bottle through sitting at my desk or at home that I try to fill up 2 or 3 times a day. And if your children are not thrilled with drinking plain water, what you could do is add slices of either lemon or lime or cucumber. There are a lot of products out on the market that kind of help infuse those fruits in our drinking water, and that way you're helping them meet their fluid needs. And then sometimes what you might need to do is track how much they're drinking. So how well are they urinating? Is the urine clear throughout the day? Just helping them meet those needs. And then also keep in mind there are some foods out there that have a high water content, such as zucchini, watermelon, cantaloupe. And we're gonna skip through these pretty quickly because Dr. Kersen covered these so well, but just the importance about planning for sick day management. So our next slide is just have a plan. So he talked so much about being in contact with your clinic and carrying your ER letter with you. On our next slide, we have some suggestions, which again come from a collaboration between Sandy and our clinic at Chalk, where we put together some recipes using Polycal mixed with things like Pedialyte, Gatorade, apple juice. And again, these are available to your dietitians through the GMDI website. And they're for all ages. You heard about the emergency letter or protocol, how important that is. So you'll be carrying that with you. And then just finally, some resources of all the wonderful organizations that support our conditions. We don't have what's on here for our dietitians, but this is mostly geared towards you. So the Fatty Acid Family Support Group, NORD, our Inform Network with Dr. Vockley, Mito Action, bringing this program to all of you. And don't forget to work with your dietitians because they have some really good contact with formula companies to get you samples, help with letters of medical necessity if you're having trouble getting some products covered. And then I believe here we go. So thank you very much for your attention. And I believe we've left some time for some questions.
Thank you, ladies, so much. That was wonderful information. So we've got a lot of questions. So we're going to try and get as many of these as we possibly can. Given the benefits of omega-3 fatty acids, especially for inflammation, can a young adult with CPT2 take them?
I will go ahead. Yeah. Yes, they can. You want to consider how much fat is in some of these essential fatty acid sources, whether they're the supplements or adding some oils. There's certainly oils that are more concentrated in omega-3 fatty acids than other oils. Flax oil tends to be one. So if you choose a source that's concentrated in these and include that in your total fat recommendation, they can definitely be included. Another suggestion might be to have your essential fatty acid profile looked at in your book, and this will give you an idea if some of these fatty acids are low and need to be supplemented or not.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Is there too much protein you can take, especially with liver concerns?
There definitely can be too much protein intake, so it's really important to work with your dietitian on the optimal amount for you. What we have seen coming out of Dr. Gillingham's studies is the importance of including really good amounts of protein, and that higher protein might be beneficial for these patients. But it doesn't need to be like the high amounts that you might see bodybuilders use and that kind of thing. So not super high, or even, what we see that's very popular, like in some of the other diets that are out there. But so it's important to watch the amount and not overdo it.
Wonderful. Since whole grains are better but have more fat, how do you balance vitamin and minerals with daily fat intake?
So that is a disadvantage of the whole grain products, in that they can have more fat than refined grain products, although it tends to not be a huge difference. What you can do is, if you're on a very tight fat restriction, is to possibly not use whole grains at every meal, but incorporate it as much as you can. Again, the fiber, other nutrients in whole grain sources tend to be better. But if you are on a very tight fat restriction, you might not be able to use them with every single meal, but try, and incorporate it into the fat restriction that is necessary for you.
Perfect. In lieu of total fat, is there a way to determine the amount of fat in grams by chain type for common food ingredients? For example, a tablespoon of shredded coconuts or a gram of long chain fat.
So on Stephanie's roundtable discussion, she mentioned the food database that has, a profile of all fatty acids in all foods. What I will suggest for the parents and patients out there is, please reach out to your dietitian in your clinic to help you look up this information. I think I usually need to look up like coconut oil at least once a year when somebody's asking about long chain fat content in that. But that's a perfect resource, and it's a really good resource. Throughout the metabolic dietitian world, we have a nutrient database called Metabolic Pro, and it often gives us that information as well. But we're happy to help you look up that information.
Wonderful. If FAODs have pro-inflammatory compounds, what are your thoughts about adding anti-inflammatory spices such as ginger and turmeric?
So Sandy, I'll go first, only because Stephanie talked about this yesterday. I thought that was a really interesting thing, and something that I don't think about enough. I think when I'm working with our patients is incorporating some of those things that can really help. I actually don't know a lot about the science behind it, but I think it's really interesting looking at some of those things. But Stephanie did suggest that about bringing some of those items in to help with the pro-inflammatory response.
Mm-hmm. So we have a comment from a parent who talks about her son hates MCT oil and the consistency. Mm-hmm. What are your recommendations about things you can mix it with? And also, are there options for a pill form?
Options for chloroform? Is that what?
Pill form, I think. Pill form.
Oh, pill form. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. That can be a problem. The acceptance of MCT oil. I would first suggest trying some of the emulsified liquids, so something like Liquigen. It does have that oily consistency, but it's much less, you don't notice it as much as you do with the oil. The MCT ProCal, which is a powder source, also tends to mix well and doesn't have that oily feel that is quite as strong as using MCT oil. Mm-hmm. I would definitely suggest looking, if you are limited to the oil sources, Dr. Gillingham's book, cookbook with FAOD recipes are, I believe all of them include MCT oil, so you can get some really good ideas from there. And then, Mary, do you want to answer the last part there?
Yeah, I think you're so on the right track. Other things that I have tried to work with my families that are really having a difficult time is just really starting with small amounts, spacing it out throughout the day as much as you can, just so that, because MCT, as all of you know that are on it or taking it, it's very upsetting to the GI tract. So trying to find small amounts, start spreading it out throughout the day. One of the things that I think as from a dietitian perspective is many of our children are on, high MCT containing formulas as babies. So we're usually really reluctant to give it up, even when they're, 2 and 3 and 4, because I think it's tolerated so much better in that whole mixture than when you're starting to do it very individualized. But so hopefully you can find some tips from like the suggestions that Sandy mentioned and the other resources, and then just starting with small amounts and really trying to work up.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
and I will say, sorry, I was just going to answer the capsule question. There are capsules. Yeah, no, that's right. There are capsules out there, pills that have MCT oil. The problem is they contain very little oil. So we've used them as kind of a supplement. And so somebody might use it, say, like they'll take it to work with them and use it there. But to get your whole MCT recommendation from pills, you have to be somebody who's really good at swallowing pills, because it can be very, very high amount. One thing that I have found that works is to come up and start this early, but a formula. So you can keep the formulas going from the companies, but also establishing a milk-based formula with the MCT early on, and using that as their source of MCT during the day. It sometimes reduces that pressure to always get that MCT into food. This is something that's in the refrigerator. That's their MCT milk. And just kind of have that, maybe one other thing. But I think sometimes parents and people just get like, oh my gosh, I got to figure out something new to put this oil in. And sometimes it's just better to have one, maybe two things that the kids learn that's what they need to take, and taking it with other food definitely helps reduce some of the GI problems associated with MCT.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Appreciate that. Do you recommend certain kinds of protein sources over others when your child is recovering from rhabdo?
I have never been asked that question before. And I'm just trying to think if I, for some of my patients, older, especially like teenagers who have maybe had some rhabdo events, I think it really comes to what they're interested in eating and just incorporating kind of a healthy meal. So I haven't necessarily thought too much about that one thing's better than other. I think what it comes down to is really what's going to help get them back on track into having a good appetite and intake. Sandy, anything?
Yeah, I don't think there's one protein or carbohydrate source that's superior over another. To try and stay hydrated and have enough carbs, etc., to hopefully prevent rhabdo from getting worse. I think it's finding something that works the best for you. And again, there's some of the recipes that we've come up with. Your dietitian can look at the GMDI website that might give some ideas. But I think it comes down to what the person tolerates more than, is there a better source here versus a better source there.
Perfect. Do you recommend whey isolate over just regular whey as a protein?
So I think it comes down to how much fat is in there. If it's just the protein, so whey isolate would be pretty much the protein. Some of the others might have more fat depending on how processed they are. Certainly, milk does have fat in it, so it depends on how it's manufactured. So I'm not so sure it matters which type of protein substitute you're using, but more look at the fat content. Whey protein in general is totally fine to use. You don't need to use some of these fancy things that are out there with different amino acids or whatever. There's really not evidence that those are more superior than using something that's more basic, like a whey protein source.
All right, so we've got time for one last question. The last question is, for a child who gags on meat, are amino acid pills a reasonable way to supplement protein intake?
So I'll start. I don't think you probably would find that necessary.
Mm-hmm.
What I think I would do is talk to your dietitian about what their main beverage is. So are they on formula, or could something like that be introduced? I would more look at some of the protein supplements like a Bena-protein or an Undri powder and incorporate that into if they're drinking like a fat-free milk. But I don't think that amino acids would be necessary.
Yeah, I agree. It's the total protein, and certainly if your child isn't a meat eater, and that's not uncommon with young kids, is to wait, maybe introduce it later. But certainly the dairy products have just protein and are often much easier for younger kids to take. And there's definitely plant sources of protein too. So I don't think you need to panic that your child is not eating meat. Again, it's just something that is harder to choose and chew, and a lot of times it just takes more time for them to get.
Ladies, thank you so much for all of your information today. This is really great. We still have some questions that came in. If it's we'll send them over, or Mary, we may throw a few in on the panel discussion that we have coming up next. Sandy, thank you so much.
Yes.
If you wouldn't mind, just really quickly, we're getting lots of requests for the website for the resources that you mentioned. If you wouldn't mind just sharing that, we're going to share your presentation. And we'll also make your slides available, but I have some folks who are eagerly waiting to write down those websites.
Okay, so the websites are on the last slide, but then we can also, your dietitians have access to the GMDI, which stands for Genetic Metabolic Dietitians International. And they have access to a toolkit that has all of the resources that we talked about, plus some others. Their handout forms or websites that they can download or recommend that you look at. So I would really suggest for some of those more difficult resources, ask your dietitian, because the GMDI does have quite a bit on their website that they can get.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, ladies, so much. We appreciate it. Mary, you're going to stay with us. Sandy, we will talk with you soon. Thanks so much.